Welcome to the Teaching Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. Thank you for watching and sharing with your family and friends, and remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons at the end of this video. In this episode, we're going to look at college football realignment. Again, in a previous episode, we looked at college football realignment NFL style, where we broke up the FBS schools into basically two divisions, an upper division featuring the Power 4 conferences and a lower division featuring the remainder of the FBS schools. And we talked about how they would be broken up and how their playoffs would be set up NFL style. And you can check out that episode also. We also did a video about how college football is broken, about how the NIL money, player transfers, and coaching changes are affecting college football and are making it, in a sense, almost unrecognizable. So in this episode, we're going to basically look at combining these two ideas. And we're going to look at college football realignment featuring promotion and relegation, where teams can be moved up from a lower division or can be moved down from an upper division depending on how they did during the previous season. This is inspired by a couple of different ideas. One is European soccer leagues. Specifically, they have promotion and relegation where if teams do well, they can move up to a higher level, and those teams and the players' salaries can be increased by a set percentage based on how high they move up. Conversely, if a team finishes at the bottom of their respective league, they can be moved down to a lower league, and the players' salaries and money for the team can be affected that way and can be reduced by a set percentage. There's an episode of Ted Lasso that even talks about this briefly. Ted Lasso's team was on the verge of being relegated and being moved down a level. And someone asked if they had this in America, where the character Ted Lasso coached college football. And they briefly talked about it, and they said, no, there's nothing like that, which is really kind of dumb. And if you think about it, it is, in a way, not a great idea. If teams do very poorly, there's no real additional motivation for the players to try to do well, the coaches try to do well, especially if the head coach has already been fired or several of his assistants have already been fired or they know they're going to lose their jobs. There isn't necessarily a lot of motivation there for them to really continue and do well. And if the players don't get along with the coaches, or if the players know that they're probably going to go to a new school and transfer anyway, there isn't that desire or that motivation to try to do well. Well, if we combine the players' salaries or the NIL money and a salary cap type of an idea with promotion and relegation, maybe that can be a remedy to the situation. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, a couple of seasons ago, Purdue finished 0-11 in the Big Ten. They didn't win a game the entire season, but they were still in the Big Ten. They could have been demoted or relegated to a different conference, to a lower level under this system. The NIL money, which in my idea in the college football is broken video, and I've mentioned a couple other times, the NIL money, which is in like a salary cap type of program, would be reduced when they went to a lower level. And then Purdue would be replaced by a team from a lower level that won their division and can be moved up, and then would be playing teams like Ohio State, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So we're going to break all that down in this video. One of the things that I was talking about, though, was having different divisions and having teams moving up and down. And this is my idea of how we can do that. It would be a 4-tier system, highest level, 2 middle levels, and a lowest level. Teams that finish at the bottom of their level, at the bottom of their conference, or the bottom of their division would move down. Teams that win can move up. And any NIL money tied to, in a sense, a salary cap would be adjusted accordingly. So here's how they would be broken down. You have an FBS level, that would be the highest level. That would be the top level of this system. Next, you would have the FCS level, then a Division I level, and then a Division I AA level. All these teams would be able to move up and down, and each one of them would play for their own national championship. We'd have these broken down by each of these 4 levels having 8 conferences. Each conference would have 8 teams. you would have 64 teams at each level. And as we go through this episode, I'll show you how I broke it down and give you some more specifics on how we did this breakdown. But one of the ways that we can do this is by having a salary cap, where if you have a $20 million salary cap, let's say for the highest level, for the FBS level, then you have the FCS level would be a 15% reduction from that 20 million. Division 1 would be another 15% lower, and then Division 1 AA would be another 10% below that. So in a sense, the Division 1 AA would be 40% less than the FBS. So that way there's motivation for teams to do well, they move up, their NIL money can increase as they move up in the system, also having a chance to play for conference championships, national championships, and they can move up that way. If a team falters, if they have a bad season like Purdue did, they could move down from the FBS to the FCS. If they have another bad season, they can continue to move down. And then the players' NIL money would be affected by that because the team would get less money and therefore their NIL money would be reduced. So there's motivation there for everyone to try to do well. Now, how would we have these regions broken up? Well, the way I did it right now was by having 4 different levels, 8 conferences at each level. And I broke them up by region. So that way, if a team moves down or a team moves up, they don't end up traveling across the country. Right now, the way the Big Ten is set up, you have USC and UCLA in Southern California in the same conference as Rutgers and Maryland on the East Coast. Or California and Stanford are in the ACC, the Atlantic Coast Conference, and have to fly across the country for all of their conference games against North Carolina and Duke and Virginia and that conference. This way, by staying regional, there's less travel, easier for vertical movement between these teams. So now let's look at these different groups, these different conferences. Starting in the Northeast, the FBS level schools will be Boston College, Maryland, Notre Dame, Penn State, Pittsburgh, Rutgers, Syracuse, and Virginia Tech. Now, most of these are ACC schools in the northeast part of the country. We did have to move some schools around. I pulled Maryland and Rutgers out of the Big Ten. I pulled Penn State out of the Big Ten, and Notre Dame is no longer an independent. They would have to join a conference to participate in the national championship and the money and all of those ideas. If they didn't want to participate, they would have to drop all the way down to a Division II level school, which I'm pretty sure Notre Dame would not want to do. But this is a northeastern area. Come up with whatever name you wanted for this conference. But these teams would play each other during the course of the season, and then they would play other FBS level conferences, and we'll talk about that in another episode. As these teams progress, if they have a bad season, let's say Syracuse finishes at the bottom of their division, and let's say Cincinnati, who is an FCS school in this model, wins their division. Syracuse and Cincinnati, in a sense, would switch places. Syracuse would move down a level. Cincinnati would move over and join the upper tier schools. If you look at the top right quadrant, you have Army, Cincinnati, Marshall, Navy, UConn, UMass, Villanova, and West Virginia. Again, these are upper level schools. We did have to drop down West Virginia out of a bigger conference, move down. Had to do that in several of these different regions. We'll talk about that more as we get into each region. But it was just the way that we had to fit all of these groups together. The third tier, which is a Division I, is Buffalo, Delaware, Delaware State, Liberty, Maine, New Hampshire. Sorry about the capitalization on New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Temple. And in the bottom tier, the 1AA is Albany, Hampton, Howard, Morgan State, Norfolk State, Richmond, Towson, and William and Mary. Tried to keep as many FBS schools in here as I could. Used quite a few FCS schools to fill out various areas. Tried to stay out of the Division II schools, of moving any of those up in the eastern part of the country. But one of the issues that we ran into, we'll get into more later, is the number of colleges in the east as opposed to the west. But this is the northeastern region, the northeastern section, however you want to do it, where these teams would move up and down or within each of these conferences. The next group that we're looking at would be basically an Atlantic Coast Conference of Southern ACC teams. Clemson, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Miami, North Carolina State, South Carolina, and Virginia. This would be the FBS level teams, the higher level teams. And this is another area where, just due to Size issues, we moved a couple of ACC teams down. I just picked two at random, being Duke and Wake Forest. I moved them down a level to the quote-unquote FCS level, where they would play Appalachian State, Charlotte, Coastal Carolina, Duke, East Carolina, James Madison, Old Dominion, and Wake Forest. So that way, if Duke won their division, they could move up. If North Carolina State finished at the bottom, they would move down. You'd have that shift there. It would be relatively easy movement, scheduling-wise. And yes, I tried to keep a bunch of these schools in their own conferences to maintain rivalries. Wasn't able to do that in every case, but I tried to do that in a lot of these cases. And again, nothing in here is set in stone. These are just my ideas. So if anybody did try to implement this like the NCAA, they could move schools around to their liking. The next area is the Division I, Bethune-Cookman, Charleston Southern, Florida A&M, Furman, Mercer, South Carolina State, Western Carolina, and Wofford. And then the 1AA division, Campbell, Davidson, Elon, Gardner-Webb, Kennesaw State, Stetson, the Citadel, and VMI. Next in the SEC, the Southeastern region. Top quadrant is the traditional SEC schools, Alabama, Auburn, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, and Tennessee. This one we used a few more FCS schools, some lower tier FBS schools to fill out the brackets with Central Florida, Florida Atlantic, Florida International, Georgia Southern, Georgia State, Jacksonville State, South Florida, and Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was one that I moved down just because until the last few years they haven't been a traditional power, and the other schools that are in the FBS quadrant, they are more the traditional Southeastern Conference schools. You have Alabama A&M, Alabama Birmingham, Alcorn State, East Tennessee State, Eastern Kentucky, Jacksonville State, Mississippi Valley State, Tennessee Chattanooga. Alabama Birmingham, they might be down a couple levels from where some people might think they should be, but I was trying to keep with all of these teams, trying to stay regional, keep some of the state schools in. For example, in the final quadrant, the 1AA, you have Alabama State, Middle Tennessee State, Moorhead, Kentucky. Not a lot of Kentucky schools in this one. You have Eastern Kentucky, Moorhead State from Kentucky, North Alabama, Samford, South Alabama, Southern Mississippi, and Troy. The next is the Northern group, or the Northern region, which is many of the Big Ten teams. Obviously, with just 8 teams in each division, you can't have all the Big Ten teams in there. But we have most of the core conference teams: Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Minnesota, Ohio State, and Wisconsin. I moved down Purdue and Northwestern mostly because they are not traditional Big Ten powers. They both have. Northwestern hasn't had a long, strong football history, and Purdue has been very up and down. So move those down. But this is where we started to get into some issues with all of the schools in the eastern part of the country. There are so many colleges that it did cause some issues sometimes with balancing out the regions. This one, Central, Eastern, and Western Michigan, Miami of Ohio, and the University of Ohio, Northern Illinois, all in that region. Division I region, mostly Indiana and Ohio teams: Akron, Ball State, Bowling Green, Butler, Dayton, Kent State, Toledo, and Valparaiso. And then in the 1AA, a lot of Illinois teams: St. Thomas of Minnesota and Upper Iowa. Those were thrown in to give Iowa and Minnesota. A couple other teams in this region other than just the big schools of Iowa and Minnesota. This is where you're starting to see some changes that need to be made. You see more in this next region, Central region. Try to kind of recreate a little bit more of the old Big 12 in the 80s and 90s and try to get these teams a little bit more central. We have Arkansas, Iowa State, Kansas, Kansas State, Louisville, Memphis, Missouri, and Nebraska. I left Iowa and Minnesota in the Big Ten because of the traditional rivalries there in the Big Ten. I could have easily moved them into this region. But with Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, some of those are some of the longest traditional football rivalries in college football history. I wanted to keep them preserved. As I mentioned before, I tried to keep rivalries together and teams in traditional conferences together. Nebraska has not always been a Big Ten school. They used to traditionally play in what was the Big 8 and the Big 12, playing Oklahoma and Texas and those schools. So I moved them back more to the central area. In the FCS level, Arkansas Pine Bluff, Arkansas State, Central Arkansas, Drake, Missouri State, Northern Iowa, Southeast Missouri State, Western Kentucky. Through Western Kentucky in here more than in the Southeast region, a little bit closer to Arkansas and Louisville, Memphis, Missouri. They're a little bit farther west, so I thought this would be a better fit that way. Division I level, Arkansas Monticello, Central Missouri, Fort Hays State out of Kansas, Lindenwood, Missouri Southern, Northwest Missouri State, Pittsburgh State in Kansas, Tennessee Martin, and then Arkansas Tech, Emporia State, Harding, Henderson State, Kearney of Nebraska, Lane, Southern Arkansas, and Truman. Just a couple of Nebraska schools here, not a lot to choose from, which is why as we get into these more Western conferences, you're going to start to see some more Division II teams being moved up to try and balance it out, as opposed to having such an Eastern heavy division of power. The next group is the South group. This is mostly a Texas, Louisiana area and Oklahoma. We have Baylor, LSU, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Texas Christian, Texas, Texas A&M, Texas Tech. In the FCS level, Houston, Louisiana Tech, Rice, SMU, Texas State, Tulsa, Tulane, and University of Louisiana Monroe. SMU in Houston, they've been doing better lately, playing in their conferences, but I thought I'd move them down. Again, keeping this more regional and limiting it to 8 schools per level. Had to move some teams down. In the Division I level, the lower left quadrant, you have Incarnate Word, Lamar, North Texas, Sam Houston State, Southeast Louisiana, Stephen F. Austin, Louisiana Lafayette, and UT San Antonio. And lastly, Abilene Christian, Grambling, McNeese State, Nichols State, Northwestern Louisiana, Prairie View Southern, and Texas Southern. Again, keeping these mostly Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas schools. The number of schools there, it was easier to kind of keep these in a region together. Now, we call this one the Intermountain region or the Mountain region. This is where you start to see lower level schools getting moved up, being brought up from Division II to fill out these levels. In the long run, I think this will benefit some of those schools, but right now I would say that this Intermountain region is probably the weakest overall division, just because there are so many Division II schools that we had in here to have to move up. Starting with BYU, Colorado, Colorado State, Nevada, UNLV, Utah State, Utah, and Wyoming. Then the next level, Air Force, Montana, Montana State, North Dakota State, South Dakota State, and Weber State. All of the academies, Army, Navy, and Air Force, I put them at the FCS level because I think that's a little bit more appropriate for the level of them to be at. They're all very good football programs, and this way maybe we can maintain them for playing for the Commander-in-Chief's trophy. I always wanted to try and keep Army and Navy together and have them play every year. That is I think one of the most important football games of the year as far as a traditional rivalry goes. Now we start getting into more Division II schools. You have Augustana out of South Dakota, Chadron State of Nebraska. While this is a Nebraska school, it's on the very western edge of Nebraska and is much closer to Colorado and Wyoming than any of the other Nebraska schools. Colorado State Pueblo, Northern Colorado, Northern State of South Dakota, University of Sioux Falls, Southern Utah, and Western Colorado. I included Northern State University in Sioux Falls and Augustana. These are all South Dakota schools to match up with South Dakota and South Dakota State being more westerly and being more in the plains area of the country. They fit in better than going east or going south in kind of the central areas of the breakdown. And the last group, many of these schools are already in a conference in Colorado, New Mexico, Western Nebraska. That's Adams State of Colorado, Black Hills State, South Dakota, Colorado Mesa, Colorado Mines, Fort Lewis of Colorado, Minot State of North Dakota, South Dakota School of Mines, and Utah Tech. I would say out of all these schools, Minot State is probably the biggest outlier. I threw in another North Dakota school just to kind of balance this out a little bit and to fill out the bracket. And lastly, the last region, Pacific region. Traditionally, the main schools are the traditional, what was the Pac-8, became the Pac-10, then the Pac-12, but it's Arizona, Arizona State, Oregon, Oregon State, UCLA, USC, Washington, and Washington State. Next lower level, the FCS, since California and Stanford were in the ACC, I put them at this lower level. Boise State, try to get them in the Intermountain region, but also want to keep them tied with Idaho and Idaho State, keeping a little interstate rivalry there. So I put Boise State, California, Fresno State, Hawaii, San Diego State, San Jose State, and Stanford all in the FCS region. In the Division I region, we have Eastern Washington, Idaho, Idaho State, New Mexico State, Sacramento State, UC Davis, and University of Texas, El Paso. El Paso is so far removed from most of the rest of the Texas schools. To me, it seemed like a better fit to move them into this western area where they match up with New Mexico State better, that same region. UC Davis, which is an FCS school, but has a strong football program. I think this is a good fit for them. And then the last group is mostly Division II schools: Cal Poly, Central Washington, Eastern New Mexico, New Mexico Highlands, Northern Arizona, Portland State of Oregon, Western New Mexico, and Western Oregon. So while the end of this region is obviously not up to the quality of players and standards as the top end of the region with USC, UCLA, and Oregon, I think that as time goes by, if we did this, teams moving up and down, you will get some of these better teams moving up and teams finding the right level for their success level. I mentioned about an NIL money and salary cap. So where is all this money going to come from? Where are we going to get this money to fund these programs, to provide them with money? Well, there is the NIL money and the boosters, but is there some other way that we can provide money for these schools, especially many of the lower level schools, the Division II schools, the mountain region and the western region that we were just talking about, where we had to use a lot of Division II schools to move them up to fill out these brackets? Is there a possibility of revenue sharing at each level? Not that Washington and Oregon would share the money with Western Oregon, so to speak, at those different levels, but at each level, revenue sharing across the board. So all of the FBS schools would share money, the FCS schools would share money across all of the regions. They do the same type of thing in the NFL, so maybe a similar type of revenue sharing agreement where teams can have a little bit more balance as far as the money goes, so they can be more competitive in getting players, getting coaches, and all the teams can be a little bit more financially stable. So this is where some money can come in. But there's a different way where potentially you could get money, and that would be through the TV revenue deals. And especially at the FBS and the FCS level, there may be a way to get all of these games on TV and deal with the TV executives. Definitely at the biggest schools, most of those games are broadcast already with all the various networks, the ABC, ESPN networks combination, CBS, Fox, and NBC, and all of their subsidiary networks. You have all the games on Peacock. You have all the different Fox Sports networks at whatever part of the country: Fox Sports South, Fox Sports North, Fox Sports Midwest, CBS and Paramount. They're all broadcasting many of these games. So maybe the top two levels can be tied to the networks. And then the lower levels with subsidiary funding, maybe from television networks, maybe from the revenue sharing, whatever it could be. All these games are not being televised, partly because of the replay aspect in all the college games that we're looking at now. So let's tie this together with the networks. I broke this down, each of the four major networks that broadcast college games right now, and I broke them down basically in a sense kind of by conference or by region. So that way each of these networks would have two regions of college football. I tried to give all of them one strong region, maybe one a little bit weaker region as far as television broadcasting and rights. But as you can see here, we have ABC and ESPN. They would be the North Division, which would be like the Big Ten schools, and the Pacific schools like Arizona, Washington, USC. CBS would get the traditional SEC powers: Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, those teams, and the Mountain West or the Intermountain region with BYU, Colorado, Colorado State, and Utah. Fox would get the ACC schools, the southern part of the ACC like Clemson, North Carolina State, and the central schools such as Nebraska, Kansas State, that region. And then NBC would get the Northeast schools: Boston College, Notre Dame, Penn State, and then the southern schools: Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, that region. With their various networks, they could cover most of the games at the FBS and the FCS levels. All of them would have teams that are potentially competitive for a national championship, and hopefully all these regions will be balanced talent-wise. There's always different ways you can adjust these, but I put the Pacific Coast with ESPN because ESPN does more of the late night broadcasting. They used to have a deal with the Pac-10 or the Pac-12 where they would broadcast the games later at night, the 9 o'clock start times, 10 o'clock start times. They did some of that with some of the Mountain West teams like Boise State and Utah. So oftentimes they played their games later compared to the East Coast teams. But by giving them the North and the West, ABC, ESPN has maybe a broader aspect where they can start games at noon Eastern time all the way to 10 o'clock Eastern time. CBS has a balance with the Southeast and the Mountain West. Fox has a coastal and then the central, where the Kansas State, Iowa State, Nebraska region, those games can be played a little bit more at night, or they could be the noon games, because the ACC oftentimes plays a lot of their games with start times at 7 o'clock Eastern. And then NBC has the South, which would be Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and then the Northeast, Boston College, Syracuse, that area. So all of those different networks could have those regions. If they have a revenue sharing agreement or TV deals similar to what the NFL has with the various broadcasting partners, that money could be spread out through the FBS and the FCS schools, balance out that revenue so teams can be competing on more of an even playing field. And with all that money, there's all kinds of money to spend here. I mentioned earlier about a $20 million salary cap. It can be higher, it can be lower, but if we have revenue sharing and the TV revenue deal similar to the NFL, maybe that money can be a little bit higher, would be split evenly among the players. Like I mentioned in a previous episode, the NIL money, treating the NFL or the college football like the NFL, the NIL money would have a minimum floor where every player would get a minimum amount of money, so that way the quarterbacks don't get all of the money. Just have it balanced out that way. So these are just some of my ideas of how we can adjust college football, realign college football, and have teams with promotion and relegation, moving teams up, moving teams down, and having some consequences if teams don't do well, having it be a consequence to not just the coaches or the players, but the whole university in general, and benefits for teams that are consistently good and move up. In a sense, an example of this is North Dakota State. North Dakota State has been a Division II power, then moved up to the FCS level, where they have been a football power for years. Now they're moving up to the FBS level in the Mountain West Conference starting in the fall of 2026, I believe it is, where they're going to move up and play at a higher level of competition. So in a sense, North Dakota State, based on the current system, has the opportunity to possibly play Ohio State or Notre Dame for the national championship game. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen anytime soon, but right now it's not a reality. North Dakota State does not have the funding to get the best players, such as an Oregon does, or a Notre Dame does, or a Texas does, or a Texas Tech. They don't have the money for that. So theoretically, how can they really compete? Doing it this way, having a salary cap, movement of teams that are having success can move up and potentially play the bigger schools where they can't get them scheduled right now. The only way North Dakota State can play these bigger schools is by moving up to the Mountain West Conference, and they're still probably not going to get games against Michigan and Oklahoma and Arizona. They're not going to schedule them very often because those bigger schools don't want to possibly be upset. And while the money is good for the lower schools, a bigger school like in Arizona, who a couple of years ago played North Dakota State and barely won the game, if they get upset, Arizona now has to deal with the embarrassment of an upset and has to give North Dakota State a check. A lot of the bigger schools don't want to do that. That's why they play the FCS schools or sometimes even like Division II schools to fill out their schedule. Well, that's not competitive either. This way, we have more of a competitive balance. Schools are playing each other. We'd still be able to keep the bowl system, which would be a benefit to the communities, benefit to the teams, and still have an objective college football playoff that would have a definite determined national champion. So that's coming up on a future episode, so look for that. This has been the Teaching Football Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. Thank you for watching. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you on our next episode.